they've turned for home now in the election race. Less than 3 weeks till polling day. Pre-poll voting starts a week from today. The opposition's had its campaign launch yesterday. As you know, there's another debate scheduled for this Sunday. The negative advertising is now more prominent from both sides. In other words, this contest is now starting to get real. And the bad news for the government, and probably for the country, is that Labor, according to Newspoll, remains in a leading position. The two-party preferred outcome remains stuck on 53% for Labor and 47% for the coalition. It hasn't moved for a month, and that's not the most worrying news for Scott Morrison. When it comes to the primary vote, where Labor was in freefall a few weeks ago and the coalition was on the rise, well, the coalition vote has become stuck on 36%, and Labor's has ticked up now to 38%. Now, that's nowhere near good enough for the government to hold office. They need to be 4 or 5 points ahead of Labor on primary vote to make up for all the preferences, Green preferences and the like, flowing Labor's way. The coalition really needs to be at least 4 points and more likely 5 or 6 points ahead of where it is right now. It needs to be over 40% primary vote. And there are only 19 days to go now. Scott Morrison remains preferred Prime Minister. His personal favourability is higher than Anthony Albanese's, but none of that matters much unless it drives actual voting intention. Still, the recovery in Labor's primary vote, remember I pointed this out last week, this arrest of Labor's decline has happened mostly during a period they've been able to hide Albanese. It's happened while he was in COVID isolation. They were dropping him right out of the media cycle and away from scrutiny as much as possible. So the head-to-head contest over the final 3 weeks is the real opportunity for the government and Scott Morrison, and it's the big risk for Labor. Labor can't hide ALBO for a week again in this campaign. So what they're doing is surrounding him with other senior Labor figures. Today, he joined the Queensland Premier Annastacia Palaszczuk in Brisbane for a Labor Day march, wouldn't you know? Fair enough if you're into protests and that sort of thing. But have a listen to the Queensland Premier when she said Albanese would unite the country.
The Prime Minister of this country had a golden opportunity to unite this country. And during a pandemic, he chose to divide. He chose to attack Queensland, attack Victoria and attack Western Australia.
Scott Morrison divided the country? The man who instituted the National Cabinet divided the country? I beg your pardon, Annastacia Palaszczuk. She says the Prime Minister divided the country when it was state premiers like her and Mark McGowan and others who slammed shut their borders, tore families apart, stopped people going to their parents' funerals, for crying out loud. Palaszczuk had Coolangatta and Tweed Heads divided by a police-enforced barrier reminiscent of the Berlin Wall. And when we had cases of people not being able to cross the Queensland border for healthcare, cases like the northern New South Wales mother who lost a baby after she was forced to fly 800 kilometres south to a Sydney hospital, well, what we got from Palaszczuk was just stuff like this.
People living in New South Wales, they have New South Wales hospitals. In Queensland, we have Queensland hospitals for our people.
Incredible, isn't it? The audacity, the deception, the hide, the rank hypocrisy of accusing Morrison of dividing the country when Palaszczuk has behaved like that. Imagine what else would happen if these people were working hand in glove with Anthony Albanese, these state Labor leaders and the Greens, and maybe a couple of teal Green left independents. Then you'd see a divided country, divided between the woke and the sensible, divided between reality and virtue signalling. Now, sadly, there aren't too many big policy arguments in this election. That's partly because the coalition foolishly ceded the climate change ground and committed to net zero by 2050. So energy security and energy prices ought to be a big election battle, but they aren't this time around, which is a big benefit for Labor, because their plans are, of course, disastrous in this area. But even with its small target strategy, Labor just couldn't help itself, could it? Even while it promises to have the same aims on foreign policy and standing up to China, even while Labor promises to be hardline on defence and pledges to be tough on border protection, hell, it even says it'll be responsible on budget management and debt. Even with all that, Labor just couldn't resist a strange policy that would dramatically expand the reach of government. Yesterday, it announced a home ownership plan where the federal government will actually have a 40% stake in your house. This is some weird nationalisation, even socialisation of the housing market. A socialist left faction leader as Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, would have government taking a 40% stake in some houses. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? The great Australian dream used to be home ownership. Now it's allowing the government to own a chunk of your home. This is a worry, mark my words, and if it ever comes to fruition, it will all end in tears.
So what happens if you decide to renovate your home? I mean, what Labor have been very clear about is they have a share in your home, and so as your home value increases, they're making money off you.
Yeah, and the questions keep coming. So many questions, so few answers. In another Labor thought bubble that could yet unravel before election day. But given Labor doesn't have much to talk about when it comes to sensible policy initiatives, its launch yesterday was more about Twitter-level mockery of their opponents.
I know I can count on Penny and Richard, Katie and Jim, and so many others to make the arguments for Labor. But who's he got? Alan Tudge and Peter Dutton. The unspeakable and the unthinkable.
Yeah, I don't know, ALBO. The so-called mean girls and their protector, the accident-prone Richard Marles, against Tudge and Dutton. Tudge, who's been putting facts and reality back into the national curriculum, and Dutton, who's stopped the boats and is now strengthening our defence forces. Would voters prefer Christina Keneally or Marles to keep the people smugglers at bay or build up our defence forces? Not a smart comparison, I don't reckon. And what about this?
Two leaders who left lasting legacies, who changed Australia for the better, who never said, "It's not my job."
I'd be hiding Kevin Rudd rather than associating with him. And Keating, well, he's revered by Labor people, but not by anyone who had a mortgage back in the day. And while he didn't say, "It's not my job," a lot of us remember him saying this. Yeah, Keating gave people the recession they had to have. He saw unemployment skyrocket, then said, "Go and get a job." These are not great memories for most people. Still, Labor reckons it's all about personalities, and it's on to a winner.
People know Scott Morrison goes missing when the going gets tough. People know Scott Morrison's response to the bushfire crisis was a dismissive, "I don't hold a hose, mate." People know he said it isn't a race to bring vaccines to Australia. People know he said that if you can't afford your rent, just buy a house. I reckon people know all about Scott Morrison. They've worked him out.
Well, he might be right. Or people might think this country has done pretty well during a very difficult time, and one leader has been at the helm through all of it. Labor tells us it can make everything better, even get us a wage rise, by not doing very much at all, except taking a stake in your home and building some recharging stations for Tesla owners. If ever there was a devil-you-know election, this one is it. Morrison should try to debate Albanese each and every day. He needs to engage with the Labor leader as much as possible, even, and this is a big concession because it's a home ground advantage for the Green left, but even if that means having an extra debate at the ABC.